Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a shortcut to understanding one of the most foundational documents in American history, the Bill of Rights. These are those first 10 amendments that promise, well, so many of our fundamental freedoms. But what's truly fascinating, I think, is how many misconceptions there are about it. Like, many people think it was written quickly or that its meaning is sort of fixed and unchanging.
Yeah, they couldn't be further from the truth, really.
The reality is far more complex. We're going to unpack its surprising origins, how it's been shaped and, reshaped over centuries through landmark court cases, and why it's frankly more relevant than ever in our modern world. Our mission today is to sift through the history, the philosophy, the legal battles, to give you that aha moment about the rights that govern so much of your life.
And what's critical to understand, I believe, is that the Bill of Rights wasn't born in isolation. Not at all. It's this brilliant synthesis of ancient traditions, revolutionary philosophy, and the direct, often painful experiences of the American colonists. We'll explore how its principles evolved, helping us understand not just what these rights are, but importantly, why they matter, and how they continue to be debated in really profound ways.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. When we talk about American freedoms, we're not just starting the clock in 1791, are we?
No, definitely not. The roots stretch back much further. You're talking English fields, Enlightenment salons, and of course the simmering discontent right here in the American colonies. Absolutely. You'll find really three distinct currents that kind of converge to create this monumental document. First, there's the English inheritance. The colonists thought of themselves as Englishmen, heirs to a long tradition of rights. Take the Magna Carta from 1215. Now, primarily it was an agreement between King John and his rebellious barons, but it planted this crucial seed that even a king's power wasn't absolute. It introduced principles like due process, trial by jury. These are precursors to what we now find in our Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Clause 39 is key there.
And centuries later, you have the English Bill of Rights in 1689, after the Glorious Revolution. That seems like an even clearer blueprint for our own, doesn't it? What were its most direct contributions?
It really was a direct influence. It explicitly forbade cruel and unusual punishments.
The exact phrase we use.
It's like verbatim in our Eighth Amendment.
Yeah.
And the guarantee that Protestants could have arms for their defense, well, that became an ancestor of our Second Amendment, born directly from the Crown's attempts to disarm dissidents back then. And beyond just these big statutes, English common law also had a profound impact. The old maxim, every man's house is his castle, from Semane's case in 1603. And later made famous by William Pitt.
Yeah, I've heard that.
That became a foundation idea for the Fourth Amendment, protecting the home from arbitrary intrusion. Similarly, that 1765 English case, Antig v. Carrington, it famously condemned general warrants.
Those sweeping search warrants?
Right, non-specific ones. The U.S. framers revered that case, saw it as a crucial guide.
Okay, so we have these foundational legal structures. But where did the revolutionary spirit come from? The idea that rights aren't just granted by a king, but are, inherent.
That's where the Enlightenment's influence really kicks in, particularly John Locke, his two treatises of government. Well, that was revolutionary stuff. He introduced this idea of inalienable natural rights, life, liberty, and property that exist before government.
Before government. Okay, so that's a huge shift from someone like Hobbes, right, who thought you gave up freedom for order.
Precisely. For Locke, the social contract was a two-way street. Government's whole purpose was to protect these rights that already existed. And if it became tyrannical, the people had the right to revolt. This framework just profoundly shaped American revolutionary thought. You see it echoed right in the Declaration of Independence. Rights are inherent, not gifts from the government.
Makes sense.
And other thinkers contributed too, of course. Montesquieu's idea of separating powers to prevent despotism, Rousseau's popular sovereignty, they all reinforced these democratic ideals.
And those abstract principles were really forged into concrete demands by the colonial experience itself, weren't they? The day-to-day stuff.
Exactly. The Bill of Rights wasn't just philosophy. It was a visceral reaction to specific abuses they lived through. Those infamous writs of assistance, for example.
The general warrants again.
Yes, sweeping general warrants allowing British officials to search pretty much anywhere without probable cause.
Yeah.
James Otis's fiery 1761 speech challenging them. It was so powerful that John Adams famously said that's where the child independence was born. So that direct experience led straight to the Fourth Amendment's requirements for probable cause and, crucially, particularity in warrants. You have to say what you're searching for and where.
You can really see the line drawn there. A specific grievance becomes a foundational right.
Absolutely. Similarly, British attempts to control political discourse through seditious libel prosecutions.
Where criticizing the government could land you in jail.
Right. That directly fueled the demand for the First Amendment's protections for speech and the press. And the colony's diverse religious landscape, plus the experience with the established Church of England, drove the desire to prevent a national religion and ensure free exercise of faith again. First Amendment. And don't forget the hated Quartering Act, forcing colonists to house British soldiers. That was directly answered by the Third Amendment. Each one was a deeply felt grievance demanding a specific constitutional safeguard.
So the key takeaway here, really, is that the Bill of Rights wasn't just invented in a flash of genius. It was this carefully constructed response, a blend of centuries of legal tradition, revolutionary philosophy, and, well, raw experience. A true melting pot of ideas leading to the rights you have today. Okay, but imagine the tension back then. When the Constitution was first drafted in 1787, it had no Bill of Rights. That wasn't an accident, right? It sparked this fierce national debate.
Huge debate between two emerging factions. The Federalists, who supported the new Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who opposed it, or at least parts of it. So what's critical to understand is why some people actually argued against a Bill of Rights. It sounds counterintuitive now.
It really does.
But the Federalists, people like Alexander Hamilton, and initially James Madison too, had some pretty sophisticated arguments. They were rooted in their theory of how the new government was structured. First, they argued it was unnecessary because the federal government only had the powers explicitly granted to it, the enumerated powers.
Right. Hamilton's point in Federalist number 84.
Exactly. For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do? If the government wasn't given the power to, say, restrict the press, why explicitly forbid it?
Okay. Seems logical on the surface. What else?
Second, they warned it could actually be dangerous because any list would be incomplete. Hamilton and Madison worried that an imperfect enumeration, listing some rights but not others, could imply that any unlisted rights were actually surrendered to the government.
So the list itself could accidentally expand government power.
That was the fear. A list meant to limit could backfire. And third, Federalists kind of dismissed bills of rights as just parchment barriers. They believed written declarations alone were useless against real tyranny. True security for them lay in the structural design. Separation of powers, checks and balances, a bicameral legislature, representative government, those were their auxiliary precautions.
But the Anti-Federalists saw it very differently. They were deeply suspicious of this new centralized power, weren't they, viewing the Constitution as a potential threat?
They certainly were. A diverse group, including figures like George Mason and Patrick Henry. Their primary motivation was this profound fear of tyranny. They looked at broad grants of power in the Constitution, like the Necessary and Proper Clause, the General Welfare Clause, and saw potential for abuse. They weren't buying the Federalist assurances. They demanded explicit written limits. They argued a Bill of Rights would serve as a kind of fire bell for the people.
A clear warning signal.
Yes, a fixed standard to measure government actions and a rallying point against overreach. Plus, they pointed to their own state constitutions. Many states already had declarations of rights, like Virginia's 1776 Declaration, drafted by George Mason himself. They worried federal supremacy would just wipe those away.
Okay, this is where the story gets really interesting. How did we go from this fundamental disagreement, these two strong opposing views, to actually getting our Bill of Rights?
Well, it essentially came down to political compromise, driven by overwhelming popular demand. The American people, having just fought a revolution against what they saw as despotism, they wanted their rights spelled out, plain and simple. In key states like Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, ratification of the whole Constitution really hinged on the promise that amendments guaranteeing rights would be added soon after.
So popular pressure was key.
Absolutely. And James Madison, who was initially a staunch Federalist against a Bill of Rights, he actually evolved on this. He was partly persuaded by Thomas Jefferson's persistent arguments. Jefferson wrote him saying, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth."
Strong words.
Very. But Madison also recognized, pragmatically, that ratification might actually fail without this commitment. It was politically necessary.
So Madison, despite his initial reservations, ends up becoming the primary architect. That's quite a turnaround.
It truly is. He got elected to the first Congress, and he painstakingly reviewed over 200 amendment proposals sent in by the states. He consolidated them, refined them. After debate and revision in Congress, 12 amendments were approved in September 1789. By December 1791, 10 of those 12 were ratified by the required number of states, and they officially became our Bill of Rights.
And those other two?
One dealt with congressional apportionment, never ratified. The other, about congressional pay raises, actually was ratified eventually in 1992. Became the 27th Amendment.
Wow, over 200 years later.
Took a while. But going back to 1791, the creation of the Bill of Rights was more than just politics. It was, I think, an act of profound legal and philosophical sophistication, especially in how it dealt with that core Federalist critique about an incomplete list. And that brings us to the Ninth Amendment.
Right. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
Exactly. This was Madison's direct answer to the Federalists. It basically says, look, just because we listed some rights here doesn't mean those are the only rights you have.
That's a powerful statement, isn't it? It acknowledges there might be other fundamental rights not written down.
Precisely. For a long time, the Ninth Amendment was kind of overlooked, almost forgotten. But then, in 1965, the Supreme Court case Griswold v. Connecticut brought it back into the spotlight. Justice Goldberg, in his concurring opinion, used it as a basis for arguing for an unenumerated right to privacy, a right not explicitly lifted, but implied by the overall structure and spirit of the Constitution.
So the idea that the framers left room for rights to emerge as society evolves.
That's one interpretation, yeah. And this concept became important in later cases, like Roe v. Wade. By including the Ninth, Madison didn't just add a list. He embedded this principle that neutralized the Federalists' main worry. It reframes the Bill of Rights not as a finite catalog, a ceiling for liberty, but as a floor. In that sense, it really stands as an intellectual victory for the anti-Federalist position, ensuring the debate over the full scope of American freedom would continue for generations.
Now, for its first century or so, the Bill of Rights had a somewhat limited impact in daily life for many, right? Because it only applied to the federal government.
That's correct. If your state government violated one of these rights, the Federal Bill of Rights initially offered no protection.
But then came this profound transformation in the 20th century, the doctrine of incorporation.
Yes, this was absolutely huge. Using the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, which was ratified after the Civil War and says states can't deprive people of life, liberty, or property without due process. The Supreme Court gradually began applying most of the Bill of Rights guarantees to the states as well. It was nothing short of a second founding for American civil liberties. It nationalized these guarantees.
Meaning they now protect you not just from Washington, D.C., but from your local police officer, your city council, your state legislature.
Exactly. It's fundamental to how we experience our rights today.
Okay, so let's dive into each amendment's journey then. From 18th century concept to 21st century application. Starting with the big one, the one many consider the most cherished. The First Amendment, freedom of expression and belief, its text. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Okay, so its original intent was pretty clear. Prevent a national church, like the Church of England, and protect individual conscience and robust political debate. But its real power, especially against state action, began with incorporation. That started with Gitlow v. New York back in 1925, which began applying speech and press freedoms to the states.
And the religion clauses, the establishment and free exercise parts.
Right. For the Establishment Clause preventing government establishment of religion, Thomas Jefferson's famous wall of separation metaphor, mentioned in the Everson case, has been influential. This led eventually to the Lemon Test from Lemon v. Kurtzman in 1971 for judging if a law violates the Establishment Clause.
The Lemon Test. Remind us.
Sure. It basically asks three things. Does the law have a secular, non-religious purpose? Does its primary effect neither advance nor inhibit religion? And does it avoid excessive government entanglement with religion? A law generally has to pass all three prongs. This test, though debated and sometimes modified, was used in cases like Engel v. Vital, which struck down mandatory public school prayer.
And the protection for speech itself. That has really expanded dramatically over time, hasn't it? It's not just about political speeches anymore.
Oh, absolutely. We've moved a long way from the old bad tendency test used around World War I, where speech could be restricted if it simply might lead to illegal acts down the road. Now, the standard from Brandenburg v. Ohio in 1969 is much more protective. It's the imminent lawless action test. Speech can only be restricted if it's intended to incite immediate illegal action and is likely to actually produce it.
A much higher bar.
Much higher.
Yeah.
This protects a vast array of expression, including symbolic speech like students wearing armbands in Tinker v. Des Moines or flag burning in Texas v. Johnson. Even deeply offensive speech like the draft jacket in Cohen v. California gets protection. And for the press, the court has established a very strong defense against prior restraint, that is, government censorship before publication. Cases like Near v. Minnesota and famously New York Times Company United States, the Pentagon Papers case, affirm this. Plus, to protect robust debate about public figures, New York Times Company v. Sullivan set that high actual malice standard for libel lawsuits. Public officials have to prove the publisher knew the statement was false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth.
It's incredible how much that initial protection has evolved and broadened. Okay, shifting gears from the First Amendment's focus on speech and belief, let's tackle another right that's constantly in the news, the Second Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms, its text. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That comma placement is debated too, isn't it?
Yes. The grammar itself is part of the debate. For most of American history, the prevailing interpretation was that this was a collective right, linked directly to service in a state militia. The focus was on the well-regulated militia part.
But that changed dramatically.
It did. In 2008, the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in District of Columbia v. Heller was seismic. For the first time, the court declared that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a firearm for traditionally lawful purposes, like self-defense in the home. 2 years later, McDonald v. City of Chicago incorporated that individual right, applying it to the states as well.
So now it's recognized as an individual right, but not an unlimited one?
Correct. The Heller court itself said the right is not unlimited. It allows for long-standing, presumptively lawful regulations, like prohibitions on firearm possession by felons, or bans in sensitive places like schools and government buildings. But these decisions definitely opened a new chapter in litigation over gun control measures.
Okay. Moving on to the Third and Fourth Amendments, which really speak to the sanctity of our homes and our personal space. The Third Amendment. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Pretty straightforward. And the fourth. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
Both were, as we mentioned, direct responses to specific British abuses, forced quartering of soldiers and those hated general warrants. The Third Amendment is actually the least litigated part of the Constitution.
Probably because we don't have soldiers forcing their way into homes anymore.
Exactly. Though it did gain some unexpected significance in that Griswold v. Connecticut privacy case in 1965. Justice Douglas cited it, along with others, as contributing to the penumbras or zones of privacy that emanate from the explicit guarantees. Kind of a fascinating idea.
So not directly about privacy, but hinting at a broader right to be left alone in your home.
Sort of, yeah. Now, the Fourth Amendment, on searches and seizures, that is a constant source of legal battles. It's incredibly relevant today.
How has its interpretation changed?
Well, a key shift came with Cass v. United States in 1967. Before that, it was mostly about physical trespass. Cass introduced the reasonable expectation of privacy test. The question became not just whether police physically intruded, but whether their actions violated privacy you're reasonably expected to have.
Like tapping a public phone booth in that case?
Right. And the main enforcement mechanism is the exclusionary rule, established for federal cases earlier but applied to the states in Mapp v. Ohio in 1961. It generally means evidence obtained through an illegal search or seizure cannot be used against you in court. It's meant to deter police misconduct.
But there are exceptions to needing a warrant, right?
Oh, many. While the Fourth Amendment expresses a preference for warrants based on probable cause, the court has recognized numerous exceptions. Searches based on consent, searches in emergency situations, exigency, items in plain view, searches incident to a lawful arrest, and others. This means, in practice, most searches today actually happen without a warrant.
Okay, let's turn to the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. These are really the pillars of due process and fair trials, so central to our justice system. The Fifth Amendment covers a lot. Grand juries, double jeopardy, self-incrimination, due process, and taking private property. its key clauses. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation.
It's a bundle of crucial protections. The most famous probably comes from the Self-Incrimination Clause, Miranda v. Arizona in 1966. That's where we get the Miranda rights. You always hear recited on TV. The right to remain silent, the right to an attorney during questioning, etc. These are safeguards against coerced confessions. It also contains the Double Jeopardy Clause. You can't be tried twice for the same crime by the same sovereign. And the Takings Clause, governing eminent domain.
That takings clause caused a stir with the Kelo case, didn't it?
It certainly did. Kelo v. City of New London in 2005 saw the court interpret public use quite broadly, allowing the government to take private property, not just for, say, a road or a school, but for private economic development projects if they promise public benefits like jobs or increased tax revenue. That decision sparked a huge backlash and led many states to pass laws restricting eminent domain powers.
And the Sixth Amendment then picks up the process once you're actually facing criminal prosecution. It reads, "In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense."
Exactly. It guarantees a cluster of trial rights: speedy and public trial, impartial jury, knowing the charges, confronting witnesses. But perhaps its most transformative impact has been through the right to counsel. For a long time, that right only meant you could hire a lawyer if you could afford one. But Gideon v. Wainwright in 1963 changed everything.
Gideon, the case about the Florida man who couldn't afford a lawyer.
That's the one. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the right to counsel is fundamental and essential for a fair trial, so the state must provide an attorney to indigent defendants, those who can't afford one in all felony cases. This decision led directly to the creation of public defender systems across the country. The right was later extended to juveniles in serious delinquency cases, in regault, and even to misdemeanor cases where jail time is possible, Singer v. Hamlin.
And it's not just any counsel, right? There are standards for effectiveness.
Correct. Strickland v. Washington established a two-part test for claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. And the impartial jury guarantee has led to rules against excluding potential jurors based solely on their race, Batson, or gender, JEB.
Okay, next up, the Seventh and Eighth Amendments. Juries in civil cases and the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. The Seventh. In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved. Seems a bit dated with the $20. And no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. And the Eighth. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted.
The Seventh Amendment is interesting because, unlike most of the Bill of Rights, it has not been incorporated to apply to the states through the 14th Amendment.
Really? So states don't have to provide jury trials in civil cases?
Not as a matter of federal constitutional law. Most state constitutions guarantee it. But the Seventh Amendment itself only applies in federal court. And yes, the $20 threshold is historical, but the core right to a jury in federal civil suits remains. The Eighth Amendment, however, has been incredibly dynamic, especially the cruel and unusual punishments clause. The key phrase came from Trott v. Dulles in 1958. The court said the clause must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society.
Evolving standards of decency, that sounds like it allows for a lot of change over time.
It does. It means the definition isn't stuck in 1791. This standard has profoundly shaped death penalty jurisprudence. Furman v. Georgia in 1972 found existing death penalty schemes unconstitutional, leading to a de facto nationwide moratorium. But then Gregg v. Georgia in 1976 upheld revised statutes, allowing capital punishment to resume. Since then, the court has used those evolving standards to narrow its application, ruling out the death penalty for crimes other than murder, Coker v. Georgia, for individuals with intellectual disabilities, Adkins v. Virginia, and for offenders who were juveniles when they committed their crimes, Roper v. Simmons.
Finally, let's look at the Ninth and 10th Amendments. Unenumerated rights and reserved powers. We touched on the Ninth already. Ninth, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And 10th, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
Right, these really serve as structural bookends to the Bill of Rights. As we discussed, the Ninth Amendment, affirming those unlisted rights retained by the people, was crucial in Griswold v. Connecticut for establishing the right to privacy. It's a powerful reminder that the Constitution isn't an exhaustive list, but a foundation. The 10th Amendment affirms the principle of federalism, that the federal government only has the powers granted to it, and the rest are reserved to the states or the people. Its influence has kind of waxed and waned.
How so?
Well, after the New Deal expanded federal power, the 10th Amendment was often seen as just stating the obvious, a truism, as one court called it. But it experienced a resurgence in the late 20th century. Cases like New York v. United States and Prince v. United States established an anti-commandeering principle. The court said Congress can't simply force state legislatures or state executive officials to enact or enforce federal regulatory programs.
So reinforcing state sovereignty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And United States v. Lopez in 1995 also invoked federalism principles, striking down a federal law banning guns near schools, arguing it exceeded Congress's power under the Commerce Clause and intruded on traditional state authority.
Okay, so we've traced the Bill of Rights from its origins through the debates, ratification, and how the courts have interpreted and applied it over centuries, making it truly a living document. But these aren't just historical artifacts, are they? They're living principles, constantly being tested today. The 21st century has brought challenges the framers couldn't possibly have imagined. It really makes you ask, are these 18th century words still adequate for our modern world?
That's the critical question, isn't it? How do the principles of 1791 stand up to the digital age, global interconnectedness, evolving societal values? One enduring controversy that really highlights this is the right to vote. Now, interestingly, the right to vote isn't explicitly mentioned in the original Bill of Rights.
Right, it comes later in amendments like the 15th, 19th, and 26th.
Correct. But it's absolutely central to our democracy. And today, there's significant conflict over restrictive voting laws, things like strict photo ID requirements, proof of citizenship rules, limitations on early voting or mail-in ballots. Proponents argue these are needed for election integrity, to prevent fraud. Opponents argue they disproportionately disenfranchise minority voters, low-income individuals, the elderly, students, people less likely to have the required IDs or navigate complex rules.
And the courts have weighed in significantly here, too.
Yes, particularly the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013. That struck down the formula used in the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to determine which states needed federal preclearance or approval before changing their voting laws. Justice Ginsburg famously dissented, saying striking down free clearance when it has worked is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. No. And later cases like Brenovich have made it harder to challenge voting restrictions under other parts of the Act. It's a really live debate.
Another huge modern challenge must be applying these rights, especially the Fourth Amendment, to privacy in our digital age. How do you apply text about persons, houses, papers, and effects to intangible data floating around in the cloud or on our phones?
It's an immense challenge, frankly. You have government surveillance programs like FISA Section 702, designed to collect foreign intelligence, but which inevitably sweep up communications of Americans, raising serious Fourth Amendment questions about warrants and reasonableness. And then there's the whole issue of corporate data collection. For a long time, the third-party doctrine held sway. The idea was, if you voluntarily gave information to a third party, like your bank records or the numbers you dialed on your phone, you essentially lost your expectation of privacy in that data. The government could often get it without a warrant.
But we share so much more data now, often without really thinking about it.
Exactly. Does that old rule still make sense when Google knows your search history, Amazon knows your purchases, your cell phone provider knows your location constantly? The courts are grappling with this. Decisions like Riley v. California, which generally requires a warrant to search a smartphone, and Carpenter v. United States, which required a warrant to get long-term cell site location information, show the courts trying to adapt those old Fourth Amendment principles to new, incredibly revealing technologies. The question is, do we lose privacy rights in deeply personal information just because it's stored on someone else's computer?
And hate speech, that's another hugely contentious area for the First Amendment, isn't it? Seems like it's debated constantly on social media, college campuses.
It is. And this is an area where the U.S. is quite different from many other democracies. It's often called American exceptionalism in free speech. In the U.S., there's no general hate speech exception to the First Amendment, speech that is deeply offensive, hateful, targeted at groups. It's generally protected unless it falls into one of the existing narrow categories of unprotected speech, like incitement to imminent violence, true threats, or defamation. The Supreme Court protected even deeply offensive funeral protests in Snyder v. Phelps.
Why is the U.S. approach so different?
It's deeply rooted in the marketplace of ideas theory. The belief, often traced to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., that the best way to combat bad ideas is not through censorship, but through open debate and more speech. Let truth and falsehood grapple. But this traditional view is increasingly challenged by arguments that certain kinds of speech, particularly targeted hate speech, cause profound harm, create hostile environments, and effectively silence marginalized voices, preventing them from participating equally in that marketplace.
You see that playing out on university campuses especially.
Yes, absolutely. Fierce debates over cancel culture, trigger warnings, safe spaces, balancing academic freedom with creating an inclusive learning environment. It's a very difficult line to draw.
It's also incredibly interesting, I think, to see how the U.S. Bill of Rights stacks up against other nations' constitutions. We often think of ours as, the gold standard, the model.
Well, what's fascinating here is that while the U.S. Constitution was certainly a pioneering model, its direct influence on constitution writing globally might actually be waning somewhat. Modern constitutions written in recent decades are often much more detailed, more comprehensive, and sometimes diverge significantly from the American model.
How so? Give us some examples.
Okay, well, take the United Kingdom. They don't have a single codified constitution like ours. Rights have evolved through common law and specific acts of parliament like their Human Rights Act 1998, which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law. But crucially, they have parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament is supreme, and courts can't strike down an act of Parliament as unconstitutional.
Very different. What about Canada?
Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, from 1982, looks somewhat similar in parts, but has a really important Section 1. It's often called the Reasonable Limits Clause. It explicitly states that the charter rights are guaranteed subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society.
So an explicit balancing act built right in.
Exactly. It formally acknowledges that rights aren't absolute and allows courts to weigh individual rights against broader societal goals. And notably, Canada's charter contains no right to bear arms.
And Germany and France, they seem to take different approaches too, maybe guaranteeing a wider range of rights.
Yeah. Yes. Quite different in focus sometimes. Germany's basic law, enacted in 1949 after the Nazi era, starts with a powerful declaration: human dignity shall be inviolable. That's the foundational principle. It also includes what are sometimes called positive rights, rights that arguably require the government to act, not just refrain from acting. For example, special state protection for marriage and family. And it explicitly abolished the death penalty. France draws its rights from its revolutionary 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, but also emphasizes principles like laïcité, a strict form of secularism, and social solidarity. Their constitution includes social and economic principles, and just recently, in 2024, they amended it to explicitly guarantee the right to abortion.
That brings up a key difference, doesn't it? The absence of social and economic rights in the U.S. Bill of Rights.
It's probably the most significant structural difference between the U.S. Bill of Rights and many modern constitutions worldwide. Our document is very much a product of 18th century classical liberalism. It focuses overwhelmingly on negative liberties, freedom from government interference.
So it tells the government what it can't do to you rather than what it must provide for you, like healthcare or education.
Generally, yes. A 2022 UCLA study looking at constitutions globally found the U.S. Constitution is quite an outlier in this regard. For instance, it's one of only 28 constitutions worldwide that doesn't explicitly guarantee gender equality because the Equal Rights Amendment, despite being proposed decades ago, was never fully ratified. And unlike the vast majority of modern constitutions, there's no constitutionally guaranteed right to health care or education at the federal level. Now, these protections certainly exist through federal and state legislation in the U.S., but their absence from the foundational constitutional document makes them potentially more vulnerable to political change. It really distinguishes the U.S. approach from many other modern democracies that embrace a more expansive, socially oriented vision of fundamental rights.
So wrapping this all up, what does this mean for us right now? The Bill of Rights is clearly anything but a dusty old document just sitting in the archives. Its story is one of constant argument, redefinition, evolution. It started as a shield against federal power, feared by some as just a parchment barrier, but it's been transformed through interpretation and amendment into this truly living instrument.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, our conversation has really highlighted these enduring tensions, hasn't it?
Yeah.
The push and pull between liberty and security, the balance between individual rights and the welfare of the community, and this constant dialogue between trying to understand the original meaning and needing to adapt these principles to a world that's changing at lightning speed. I mean, how do we apply principles from 1791 designed for a world of muskets and printing presses to the age of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and global social media platforms? That's the ongoing challenge.
And that really is the challenge for the next generation, isn't it? For all of us, really. Its vitality, its meaning, depends on us actively using it, arguing about it, understanding its complexities, not just, venerating it from afar as some kind of sacred relic.
Which leads me, I think, to an important question for you, the listener. If, as many believe, a truly informed citizenry is the ultimate safeguard for liberty, then how can we ensure we move beyond just a superficial awareness of our rights? How do we cultivate a deeper understanding of their complex history, the fierce debates that forged them, and crucially, the responsibilities that come with exercising them? So maybe the challenge I'd leave you with is this. Don't stop here. Explore the foundational documents themselves, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, maybe even some writings of the Anti-Federalists. They aren't just historical relics, they're living blueprints for understanding the fundamental arguments about freedom and government power that we continue to have today. They really do invite your ongoing engagement and critical thought.
This is DigitView.